My mother showed up at my front door on a Tuesday evening in October, 20 years after she left me at a bus stop with a pink backpack and a granola bar and a lie. She was standing on my porch in a coat that was too thin for the weather, and her face was older than I remembered, but her eyes were the same, dark and quick and calculating even when they were filled with tears, and she looked at me like I was supposed to recognize her immediately. Like 20 years was nothing. Like the space between abandoning your 8-year-old daughter at a bus stop and showing up at her door crying was just a pause in a conversation she had never finished. She said, "Sophie." She said my name like it was a password. Like saying it would unlock something between us. Like the sound of my name in her mouth would erase the 20 years of silence, and the police report and the foster homes and the nights I spent as a child lying in a stranger's bed, wondering what I had done wrong, what I had said, what was so broken inside me that my own mother had decided I wasn't worth keeping. I stood in the doorway of the house I owned, the house I had bought with money I earned, in the life I had built with my own hands from absolutely nothing. And I looked at the woman who had given birth to me and then given me away, and I said, "Can I help you?" Not mom, not where have you been, not how dare you. Just can I help you, the way you speak to a stranger on your porch, because that is what she was. A stranger who happened to share my DNA. She started crying harder. She said, "They're taking the house, Sophie. Everything is falling apart. Ron is gone. I don't know what to do. You're the only one who can help me." I looked at her for a long moment. Then I said, "You should probably come inside." And she did. And that is where this story truly begins. Not on a Tuesday evening in October 20 years later, but on a bus stop bench in a small town in Michigan on a Friday afternoon in April when I was 8 years old, wearing a yellow dress with daisies on it, holding a pink backpack with a broken zipper, watching my mother's car pull away from the curb and disappear around the corner and never come back. If you are just joining this story, stay with me. Get comfortable. Because this one goes deep, and I need to tell it from the very beginning, so that you understand not just what happened, but what it meant, what it cost, and what I built from the wreckage. My name is Sophie Bennett. I am 28 years old. I live in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I am a child welfare attorney and the founder of a nonprofit organization called Safe Landing that provides legal advocacy and transitional housing for abandoned and displaced children. I have a small house with a garden and a dog named Clover and a life that is quiet and full in mine. I also have a scar inside me that doesn't show on my skin but that I feel every single day. A scar in the shape of a bus stop bench and a mother's taillights and the specific silence of a child who has been left behind and doesn't understand why. Let me take you back. My father's name was David Bennett. He was a mechanic who worked at an auto repair shop on the east side of Lansing. And he was the kind of man who came home with grease under his fingernails and picked me up and swung me around the kitchen and called me Little Bird because he said I was always singing, always humming, always making noise that filled the house with something warm. I adored my father. He was not a complicated man. He was not wealthy or powerful or particularly ambitious. He was kind and steady and present, and he loved me in the way that I have spent my entire adult life understanding was not ordinary, was in fact extraordinary, was in fact the single greatest gift anyone has ever given me, which was the gift of being loved without conditions, without performance, without earning it. My mother was different. Diane was beautiful in a sharp, restless way, the kind of beautiful that comes with awareness, the kind that knows its own power and resents its own limitations. She had married my father young, at 19, and I think she loved him in the beginning, or loved the idea of being loved by someone who adored her so completely. But as the years passed and the money stayed tight, and the house stayed small and the life stayed ordinary, something in my mother began to curdle, the way milk curdles when it sits too long slowly, and then all at once. She started sighing more. She started looking at magazines with houses in them, and then looking around our kitchen with an expression that made the walls feel smaller. She started arguments about money that ended with my father sitting at the table with his head in his hands, while she stood by the counter with her arms crossed, and I would sit in my room and listen through the thin walls and press my hands over my ears and hum to myself because the noise I made was better than the noise they made. When I was 6 years old, my father was killed in a car accident on his way home from work on a rainy Thursday in November. A truck ran a red light and hit his car on the driver's side, and he died before the ambulance arrived. I know these details because I read the police report when I was 22 years old, sitting in a law school library with my hands shaking, reading the clinical language of a document that described the end of the safest person I had ever known. He was 31 years old. I was 6. And the world as I knew it ended on a rainy Thursday in November in Lansing, Michigan, and nothing that came after was ever the same. After my father died, things moved quickly in ways I didn't understand at the time, but that I have pieced together over the years through documents and conversations and the slow archaeological work of understanding your own history. My father had a life insurance policy through his employer. It wasn't large, but it was something. There was also a wrongful death settlement from the trucking company, whose driver had run the red light. This settlement was more substantial. Combined, these funds represented a meaningful amount of money, enough to provide security for a young widow and her daughter, enough to create stability if managed carefully. My mother did not manage it carefully. What I know now, what I did not know then, is that within a year of my father's death, my mother had begun a relationship with a man named Ron Kessler. Ron was a real estate agent in a neighboring town, a man with a wide smile and a handshake, and the particular kind of charm that works on people who want to believe in easy solutions. He drove a nice car, he wore nice clothes. He talked about opportunity and growth and the future with the confidence of a man who had always been comfortable selling things to people who couldn't quite afford them. My mother fell into Ron the way a person falls into deep water, completely, and with no plan for how to get back to the surface. He was everything my father had not been, polished and ambitious and forward-looking, and I think my mother saw in him an escape from the grief and the smallness and the life she had never fully wanted. The problem was me. I was 6 years old and I had my father's eyes and my father's habit of humming in the kitchen and my father's last names, and I was a living, breathing reminder of the life my mother was trying to leave behind. Ron made this clear early, not to me directly, not at first. He was smart enough to be subtle about it, but I heard things. Children hear everything. They hear the things adults say when they think no one is listening, and they carry those things inside them like stones, heavy and sharp and impossible to put down. I heard Ron say to my mother one evening when they thought I was asleep, "I'm not raising another man's kid, Diane. I'm serious. If we're going to do this, if we're going to build something together, it has to be a clean start." A clean start. I was 7 years old and I was the mess that needed to be cleaned. My mother didn't argue with him. I listened through the wall for her argument, for her defense of me, for the moment when she would say, "That is my daughter, and she is not negotiable." The moment never came. What came instead was silence, and then murmuring, and then the sound of their conversation moving to other things, plans and logistics and the future they were building, a future that had a door in it, and I was on the wrong side. Over the next year, my mother became progressively more distant. Not dramatically, not cruelly, at least not in ways that would have been visible to anyone outside our house. She still fed me and dressed me and drove me to school. But the warmth was gone. The small gestures of love that had existed alongside my father's larger ones, the braiding of my hair before bed, the stories she used to read me, the way she used to call me my girl with a smile that reached her eyes, all of it drained away slowly, like color fading from a photograph left in the sun. I compensated by being good. I was so good. I want you to understand how good I was because it matters. I was quiet and obedient and helpful, and I cleaned my room without being asked, and I got good grades, and I didn't complain, and I didn't cry where anyone could see me. And I made myself as small and as easy and as invisible as possible because I had understood, with the terrible clarity of a child who is losing her only remaining parent, that my mother's love was conditional. And the condition was that I not be a problem. It didn't work. Being good doesn't work when the decision has already been made. Being good doesn't work when you are not the problem. When the problem is your existence itself, when the problem is that you are alive and present and inconvenient in someone else's plan. If you are enjoying this story, tell me where you are listening from right now. Drop a comment. I want to know who is with me because this next part is the hardest part of the story, and it helps to know I'm not telling it alone. The day my mother left me at the bus stop was a Friday in April. I was 8 years old. I remember the weather because it was one of those early spring days that can't decide if it's warm or cold, the kind of day where you need a jacket in the morning but not in the afternoon. My mother told me we were going on an errand. She packed my pink backpack with a granola bar, a juice box, a coloring book, and a small stuffed rabbit that I had slept with since I was 3. She put me in the car. She drove to a bus stop on the edge of town, a bench under a metal shelter near a gas station on a road that connected our town to the highway. She parked the car. She walked me to the bench. She set my backpack beside me. She knelt down and she looked at me. And her face was doing something complicated that I could not read because I was 8 years old and did not yet have the vocabulary for what I was seeing, which was guilt being overridden by selfishness in real time. She said, "Sophie, I need you to wait right here. I have to go take care of something. I'll be back soon, okay?" I said. "Okay, Mommy." She kissed my forehead. Her lips were dry. She stood up. She walked back to the car. She got in. She pulled away from the curb. And she drove away. I sat on that bench for a long time. I don't know exactly how long, because I was 8 and time moves differently when you are 8 and waiting for someone who has promised to come back. I ate the granola bar. I drank the juice box. I colored in the coloring book. I held the stuffed rabbit against my chest. I watched cars pass. I watched the sun move across the sky. I watched the shadows get longer. I waited. An hour passed. Maybe 2. Maybe 3. The afternoon got colder. I put on the light jacket my mother had packed. I sat on the bench and I held my rabbit. And I waited because my mother had said she would come back. And I believed her because she was my mother and mothers come back. They always come back. A woman who worked at the gas station near the bus stop noticed me. She came over and asked if I was okay. I said my mother had gone to take care of something, and she would be back soon. The woman looked at me for a moment, and then she went back inside. 20 minutes later, she came back out, and she brought me a bag of chips and a bottle of water, and she sat on the bench next to me, and she said, "Honey, how long has your mom been gone?" I said, "A little while." She said, "Do you know her phone number?" I did. I had memorized it because my father had taught me to memorize it before he died. And I told the woman the number, and she called it, and it rang, and no one answered. She called it again, no answer. She called it a third time, no answer. The woman looked at me with an expression I would later recognize as the expression of someone who is realizing something terrible and trying not to show it to a child. She said, "Let's go inside the store where it's warm, okay?" We went inside. She called the police. 2 officers came. They were kind. One of them was a woman named Officer Delgado, who had a gentle voice and who knelt down in front of me and asked me my name and where I lived and who my mother was. I answered everything truthfully because I had no reason to lie. I was 8 years old, and I was waiting for my mother, and I did not yet understand that she was not coming. They drove me to my house. The house was dark. The door was locked. They contacted my mother's phone again. No answer. They contacted the neighbors. No one knew where Diane had gone. They contacted my mother's sister, my Aunt Paula, who lived 2 towns over. Paula answered the phone, and when the officer explained the situation, there was a pause. A specific kind of pause that I now understand was the pause of someone who knew more than they were saying. And then Paula said she would come get me. She didn't. She called back an hour later and said she couldn't take me that night. The officers took me to an emergency child services facility. I spent that night in a room with a cot and a nightlight and a social worker named Brenda, who sat with me until I fell asleep. I held my stuffed rabbit against my face, and I breathed into its fur and I whispered, "She's coming back. She's coming back. She's coming back." She didn't come back. Not the next day. Not the next week. Not ever. What I learned over the following months, pieced together from social workers and court documents and conversations I was too young to fully understand, was this. My mother had planned her departure. She had enrolled me in no after-school programs that week. She had cleaned out the house of anything valuable. She had closed her bank accounts. She had packed her own bags. And she had signed papers through a process I still don't fully understand the legality of that effectively characterized my placement into state care as a voluntary surrender. A bureaucratic term that made it sound like she had thoughtfully and deliberately placed me in the care of state rather than what she had actually done, which was abandon her 8-year-old daughter at a bus stop and drive away. My mother moved to Indiana with Ron Kessler. They bought a house. They got married. They had a son named Chase. They built a life, a clean start. I was the dirt they swept out the door to get it. I entered the foster care system in Michigan at 8 years old. And I want to tell you about what that was like because I think a lot of people have ideas about foster care that come from movies or news stories, and those ideas are sometimes accurate and sometimes not. And the truth of my experience was both better and worse than most people imagine. The first 2 homes were temporary placements, short stays with families who were kind but overwhelmed, Families who had too many children and not enough resources, and who treated me with the generic warmth of people doing their best in an imperfect system. I was quiet. I was good. I made my bed every morning without being asked. I did my homework without supervision. I did not cry where anyone could see me. I was performing the same act I had performed in my mother's house. The act of being easy, being invisible, being no trouble at all, because I had learned that being no trouble was the closest thing to safety I could find. The third home was bad. I will not go into details because this story is about what I built, not about what was done to me. But I will say that I was there for 4 months, and that those 4 months taught me things about vulnerability and power, and the specific helplessness of being a child in someone else's house that I have spent my entire adult career trying to change for other children. And then, when I was 10, I was placed with Ruth Collins. Ruth was a 62-year-old retired schoolteacher who lived in a small house in Grand Rapids with a cat named Pepper and a garden that she tended every morning before breakfast regardless of the weather. She was not warm in the way that movies portray warmth. She did not sweep me into her arms and tell me everything would be okay. She was firm and practical and direct. And she looked at me on the first day with her reading glasses pushed up on her head and said, "I'm not going to pretend to be your mother, Sophie, but I'm going to take care of you, and I'm going to be here every day, and I'm going to mean it." And she did. She was there every single day. She helped me with homework. She made me eat vegetables. She took me to therapy, which I resisted at first with the stubbornness of a child who has learned that trusting people leads to being left at bus stops, but which eventually became the thing that saved me, slowly and painfully and one conversation at a time. Ruth gave me structure. She gave me expectations. She gave me the particular gift of being treated like someone whose future mattered. And she did this not with grand gestures but with daily consistency, the most underrated form of love there is. She came to my school events. She read my report cards. She argued with my teachers when she thought they weren't challenging me enough. She sat at the kitchen table with me while I did homework, and she graded papers from her own years of teaching, and we existed in a quiet companionship that was the first real stability I had known since my father died. I want to tell you about something that happened when I was 14, because it is important to the rest of the story. I was in Ruth's living room on a Saturday afternoon, looking through a local newspaper because Ruth still subscribed to actual newspapers and insisted that reading them was a form of civic duty. I was flipping through the community section, barely reading, when I stopped. There was a photo, a family photo. A man and a woman and a boy, smiling, standing in front of a house with a sold sign in the yard. The caption read, "Ron and Diane Kessler and their son Chase celebrate the purchase of their new home in Carmel, Indiana." I looked at the woman in the photo. I looked at her dark eyes and her sharp face and her smile, and her hand on the shoulder of a boy who was maybe 5 or 6 years old, and who had the comfortable posture of a child who has never been left anywhere. My mother. My mother and her new family and her new house and her new son. She hadn't just left me. She had replaced me. She had built a new family, a clean family, a family without the inconvenient daughter. And she was smiling in a newspaper photo like she had never had another child, like I had never existed, like the bus stop had never happened. I put the newspaper down. I went to my room. I sat on my bed for a long time. And then I did something that I did not understand the significance of at the time, but that would matter enormously later. I went back to the living room and I cut the photo out of the newspaper, and I put it in a box under my bed where I kept important things. My father's death certificate, my birth certificate, the police report from the bus stop that Ruth had obtained for me, and now this. Evidence. Proof that my mother was alive and well and had chosen to build a life without me in it. At 16, Ruth told me something that changed everything. We were sitting at the kitchen table after dinner, and she said, "Sophie, I need to tell you something about your father." I looked at her. She said, "When your father died, there was a life insurance payout and a wrongful death settlement from the trucking company. That money was supposed to go into a trust for you. Your mother was named as the trustee because you were a minor." She paused. She said, "I've been doing some digging. I'm not sure that money ever reached you." I felt something cold move through my stomach. I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "I mean that your mother was given control of a significant amount of money that was designated for your care and your future, and as far as I can tell, none of it was ever used for you. No education fund, no savings account, no trust disbursement, nothing." I sat with that information. I was 16 years old, and I sat with the information that my mother had not only abandoned me, but had potentially taken money that my dead father had left for me and used it to build the life she had replaced me with. The house in the newspaper photo, the new family, the clean start, built with my father's death, built with money that was supposed to be mine. Ruth said, I don't have all the details, but I have some documents that might help you when you're older. I've been keeping them for you. She showed me a small box. Inside were papers she had collected over the years, correspondence from social services, references to the settlement, insurance documents with my father's name on them. She had been quietly gathering evidence for years, the way a former teacher gathers research, methodically and with purpose. She said, when you're old enough, you can decide what to do with this. I took that box and I put it with my other box, the one with the newspaper clipping and the police report, and I closed the lid and I understood that I was building something without fully knowing what it was. An archive. A record. A case. I graduated from high school with honors. I was third in my class. Ruth sat in the audience and clapped louder than anyone, and afterward she took me to dinner at a restaurant that was nicer than anywhere we usually went, and she said, Your father would be so proud of you, Sophie. And I am too. I received a full scholarship to the University of Michigan. I chose pre-law because by that point I knew exactly what I wanted to do with my life. I wanted to be an attorney. Specifically, I wanted to be a child welfare attorney. I wanted to stand in courtrooms and fight for children who had been abandoned and neglected and failed by the systems that were supposed to protect them. I wanted to be the person I had needed when I was 8 years old sitting on a bus stop bench with a pink backpack, the person who would have walked up to that bench and said, I see you. I know what happened, and I am going to make sure it never happens again. Have you ever dealt with a parent who abandoned you? I know there are people listening right now who understand exactly what this feels like. Drop a comment and tell me your story, because I read every single one, and I promise you are not alone in this. College was hard. Not academically. Academically, I was prepared because Ruth had spent years making sure I was challenged and disciplined and capable. But socially, emotionally, college was the first time I was surrounded by people my own age who had families, who went home for holidays, who called their mothers on Sunday evenings, who talked casually about their childhoods, as if childhood was something safe and warm and unremarkable. I didn't know how to participate in those conversations. I didn't know how to answer the question, what does your mom do? I usually said, she's not in the picture, which was vague enough to end the conversation without creating drama. And people would nod sympathetically and change the subject, and I would be grateful for the change, because explaining what had actually happened would have required me to open a door that I kept very firmly shut during those years. I studied relentlessly. I worked 2 part-time jobs. I interned at a family law firm during my junior year. And I saw for the first time the inside of the legal system that had processed my own abandonment, and I understood both its power and its failures. The places where it protected children, and the places where it allowed people like my mother to slip through cracks wide enough to lose a child in. I went to law school. I graduated near the top of my class. I passed the bar on my first attempt, and then Ruth died. She was 76. She died of a stroke on a Wednesday morning in January, alone in her house, which is something I think about sometimes. The fact that she died alone after spending years making sure I never felt alone, and the unfairness of that sits inside me in a place I have never been able to resolve. I was 24 years old. Ruth left me her house. She left me her cat Pepper, who was old by then and who died 6 months later, and she left me the box. The box with the documents, the insurance references, the settlement papers, the correspondence from social services. She had added to it over the years. There were more documents now, more references, more threads that connected to the money my father had left and the question of where it had gone. I sat in Ruth's kitchen, which was now my kitchen, and I opened the box and I spread the documents across the table, and I looked at them with the eyes of a lawyer now, not a child, not a teenager, but a trained legal professional who understood what she was looking at. What I was looking at was a trail, a financial trail that connected my father's wrongful death settlement to my mother's new life. The settlement had been paid into a trust. My mother, as my legal guardian at the time, had been named trustee. The trust was supposed to be managed for my benefit, for my education, for my care, for my future. Instead, the trust had been quietly drained over a period of about 2 years after my father's death. The money had been withdrawn in increments, transferred to accounts in my mother's name, and eventually used, as near as I could determine from the documents Ruth had gathered, to fund the down payment on the house in Carmel, Indiana. The house in the newspaper photo. The house where my mother and Ron and Chase had built their clean start. My father's death had paid for the house that replaced me. I sat at that table for a very long time, and then I did what Ruth would have wanted me to do. I started building the case, not for revenge, for truth. Over the next 3 years, I built my career and I built my case simultaneously. I took a position at a family law firm in Grand Rapids that specialized in child advocacy. I was good at it. I was very good at it because I understood the clients in a way that most attorneys don't, understood their fear and their shame and their confusion and their desperate need to be believed because I had been them. I won cases. I built a reputation. I was known in the legal community as someone who was thorough and relentless and compassionate, someone who prepared cases with the precision of a surgeon and argued them with the conviction of someone who had personal stakes in the outcome. Which I did, even when the case wasn't mine, because every child I represented was, in some way, the 8-year-old girl on the bus stop bench. At 26, I founded Safe Landing. It started small, a nonprofit that provided legal representation to children in the foster system who didn't have advocates. I funded it initially with my own savings and a small grant. Within 2 years, it had grown into something larger, providing not just legal advocacy but transitional housing, educational support, and therapy services for displaced and abandoned children across Western Michigan. I hired 3 full-time attorneys and 2 social workers and a therapist. I partnered with schools and hospitals and community organizations. I built something real and lasting and meaningful, something that existed because an 8-year-old girl had been left at a bus stop and had grown up to make sure other children didn't fall through the same cracks. And then, at 28 years old, on a Tuesday evening in October, my mother showed up at my door. Now you know the full story of what came before. Now you understand what she was walking into when she stepped through my doorway. Let me tell you what happened next. I sat my mother at my kitchen table. The same kitchen table where I had spread Ruth's documents 2 years earlier. I offered her water. She took it with shaking hands. She looked around the house, Ruth's house, my house, and I could see her calculating, assessing, trying to determine how much I had and how much of it she could access. She told me her story. Ron had died 8 months earlier, heart attack. He had left behind a mess of debts and a house with a mortgage that was underwater, and a son, Chase, who was 20 years old and had no job and no direction and no ability to help. Diane was facing foreclosure. She was facing the loss of everything she had built, which it was everything she had built with money she had stolen from her dead husband's trust for the daughter she had abandoned. She didn't say it that way, of course. She presented herself as a victim of circumstances, a widow struggling to survive, a mother reaching out to her daughter in a time of need. She used the word family 3 times in her first 10 minutes at my table. She said, "We're still family, Sophie." I let her talk. I let her unspool the entire narrative she had prepared, the version of events in which she was a sympathetic figure, a woman who had made difficult choices in difficult times, a mother who had always loved her daughter but had been unable to care for her. I listened to every word, and then I said, "Can I show you something?" I went to my office. I came back with a folder. I placed it on the table between us. I opened it. The first document was the police report from the bus stop, the original report filed by Officer Delgado on a Friday in April 20 years ago, documenting the discovery of an 8-year-old girl who had been left alone at a bus stop by her mother, who could not be located. My mother looked at it. Her face went pale. The second document was a copy of the voluntary surrender papers she had signed, the papers that had made her abandonment look official and deliberate rather than what it actually was, which was a woman leaving her child on a bench and driving away. The third document was the trust documentation, my father's wrongful death settlement, the trust established for my benefit, the withdrawal records showing the systematic draining of the trust over 2 years, the transfer records showing where the money went, her accounts, Ron's accounts, the down payment on the house in Carmel, Indiana. The fourth document was the newspaper clipping from when I was 14. The photo of Diane and Ron and Chase smiling in front of their new house. The house my father's death had paid for. The house built on the foundation of my stolen future. I laid each document on the table one at a time. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I did not tremble. I was not the 8-year-old girl on the bench anymore. I was a 28-year-old attorney who had spent years preparing for this exact moment, not with malice but with clarity. And clarity is more devastating than anger because anger can be dismissed but clarity cannot. My mother stared at the documents. She said very quietly, "Where did you get these?" I said. "A woman named Ruth Collins spent years collecting them for me. She was my foster mother. She raised me. She loved me. She died 2 years ago. And before she died, she made sure I had every piece of evidence I would ever need to understand exactly what you did." My mother was crying. Tears on the kitchen table. Tears on the documents. I moved the documents slightly so they wouldn't get wet because they were originals and I protect what matters to me. She said, "Sophie, I was young. I was struggling. Ron pressured me. I didn't know what else to do." I said, "You were 27 years old. You had a life insurance payout and a settlement that together totaled over $200,000. You had resources. You had options. What you didn't have was the willingness to be my mother." She flinched. I said, "You took money that my dead father left for me. Money from his death. Money that existed because he died on a rainy Thursday on his way home to us. You took that money and you used it to buy a house for your new family. The family that replaced me." She said, "It wasn't like that." I said, "It was exactly like that. I have the bank records." There was a long silence. The kitchen was quiet. Clover was sleeping in the next room. The refrigerator hummed. The clock ticked. All the ordinary sounds of a house that I had built into a home that no one had given me, that I had earned and created and filled with my own life. She said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I am going to tell you what I am willing to do and what I am not willing to do." She waited. I said, "I am not going to save your house. The house that was purchased with stolen money is not something I am going to help you keep. If it goes to foreclosure, that is the consequence of decisions that were made 20 years ago." Her face crumpled. I said, "I am also not going to pretend that what happened didn't happen. I am not going to perform forgiveness for your comfort. I am not going to play the role of the grateful daughter who was abandoned but turned out fine and therefore the abandonment doesn't matter. It matters. It will always matter," she said. "I'm your mother." I said, "You gave birth to me. Ruth raised me. There is a difference." That sentence landed in the room like a physical thing. I watched it hit her. I watched her receive it. I said, "But I am also not going to destroy you. I could take legal action over the trust. I have the documentation. I have the case. A judge would look at these records and the outcome would not be favorable for you. But I am not going to do that." She looked at me. I said, "I am not going to do that because my life is not about you. It stopped being about you the day I decided to build something from what you left me with, which was nothing. I have a career that I love. I have a nonprofit that helps children like the child I was. I have a home. I have a life. And none of it came from you. And none of it requires anything from you." I closed the folder. I said, "I am willing to help you find housing assistance. I can connect you with social services that provide support for people in your situation. I will do that because it is the kind of thing I do, not because you deserve it, but because I made a choice a long time ago about the kind of person I wanted to be. And that person helps people, even people who hurt her." My mother sat at my kitchen table, and she cried, and she didn't argue, and she didn't defend herself. And for the first time in my life, I saw something on her face that was not calculation or performance, but something raw and genuine and devastating, which was the recognition of what she had lost. Not the house. Not the money. Me. She had lost me on a bus stop bench 20 years ago, and she was only now, sitting in the kitchen of the woman I had become without her, fully understanding the weight of that loss. She said, "I'm sorry, Sophie. I am so sorry." I looked at her. I said, "I believe you." And I did. Not the way a child believes, with open arms and erased history. The way an adult believes, with clear eyes and full awareness of what the apology can and cannot repair. She left my house an hour later. I gave her the phone numbers for 2 organizations that could help with housing. I gave her a card for a social worker I trusted. I walked her to the door and she stood on the porch where she had stood crying an hour earlier, and she looked at me and she said, "You look like your father." I said, "I know." And I closed the door. 2 months later, Aunt Paula called me. She said she had heard from Diane about our conversation. She said she wanted to explain her side of things. Why she hadn't taken me in that night when the police called. Why she had stayed silent all these years. I listened. Her explanation was thin and self-serving and full of the particular language of someone who has rehearsed their justification so many times they've started to believe it. I said, "Paula, you knew. You knew she was planning to leave me. You knew about the trust money. You knew about Ron. and you said nothing, not to the police, not to social services, not to anyone. She was quiet. I said, I don't need your explanation. I need you to know that I know, and I hung up. Chase contacted me once, Diane's son. My half-brother, technically. He sent me a message through social media that said, I heard about what happened with my mom, and I just want you to know I didn't know about any of it, and I'm sorry. I responded 3 days later. I said, thank you for saying that. I hope you're doing okay. We have not spoken since. Maybe someday. Maybe not. My peace does not depend on it. If stories like this resonate with you, please subscribe to this channel. There are more stories here, real and honest and human, and I think they might help you carry whatever you're carrying right now. I want to end this story with something that happened last month. I was at a Safe Landing event, a fundraiser we hold every year to support our transitional housing program. I was standing at the podium, giving a speech about our work, about the children we serve, about what it means to catch someone when they're falling. And in the middle of my speech, I looked out at the audience, and I saw a woman sitting in the third row. She was about 60 years old. She had kind eyes. She was crying. After the event, she came up to me. She said, I was a foster mother for 15 years. I had a girl who reminds me of you. She came to me scared and silent, and she didn't trust anyone. I kept showing up. Every day, I just kept showing up. I said, what happened to her? She said, she graduated from college last year. She's a teacher now. I said, you saved her life. She said, no. She saved her own life. I just held the space while she did it. I thought about Ruth. I thought about the kitchen table and the box of documents and the garden she tended every morning and the way she said, I'm going to be here every day, and I'm going to mean it. And I understood, standing in that room full of people who cared about children who had been left behind, that my story was not a story about being abandoned. It was a story about being found, not by my mother, not by the system, by myself, by Ruth, by every person who had shown up when it mattered, and by my own stubborn refusal to let the worst thing that ever happened to me be the last thing that ever happened to me. My mother left me at a bus stop when I was 8 years old. She drove away and she didn't come back. That is true. But here is what is also true. I got off that bench. I kept moving. I kept going. I built a life that is full and meaningful and mine. I help children every single day who are sitting on their own benches, waiting for someone who isn't coming, and I walk up to them and I say, I see you. I know what happened, and you are not going to go through this alone. My name is Sophie Bennett. I was left behind, and I became the person who makes sure no one else is. This is my story, and I am so glad I stayed to tell it.